you should come to Any Suggestions Doctor if you are a huge fan of Doctor Who. Um, but also, if you're not a big fan of Doctor Who, we'll tell you everything there is to know. I think one of the things that I really do enjoy about this show is that it is completely accessible. We always make a point at the start of the show of being like, "Hey, give us a big cheer if you're a big fan of Doctor Who," but also give us a big cheer if you've just been dragged along by one of your friends. And sometimes those barometers are slightly more skewed than we might expect. I think we've only ever once had a crowd where we said, "Give me a cheer, being dragged along by a friend," and there was silence. Um, but we've definitely had times where that second cheer is a little bit bigger, and we're like, "Okay, cool." So it's always going to be a show that is fun. It's, as I say, it's appropriate for people of all ages. It's exciting. It's an adventure. It can go anywhere in time and space. We've got a literal TARDIS on stage with us. We can go wherever you want. We can do whatever you want. And yeah, we're going to drop in the Doctor Who references for the big fans, but it's not going to be completely inaccessible. We're going to take you along for the ride. Like, trust me, I'm not the Doctor Who expert, like I have to spend as much time cribbing up before shows, just reading up on the TARDIS Wikia to be like, okay, in that past episode, we had such and such a character. Who actually are they? So that I can figure this out in case they come up in future. So yeah, it is completely accessible. So if you're a huge fan of Doctor Who, great, come along. You're going to love all that. If you're not a fan of Doctor Who, but you do just want a good fun hour of an exciting adventure with a really tight plot that, as I say, can go anywhere in time and space, Any Suggestions Doctor, the improvised Doctor Who parody, is the show for you. Hi, I'm Charles Dean, director and performer with Any Suggestions Improv. I'm doing a conversation about Any Suggestions Doctor, the improvised Doctor Who parody. And if you want to learn a little bit more about us and about our show, then please listen along, and I hope you enjoy what I have to say. The show, basically, when you show up to Any Suggestions Doctor, you'll be queuing outside. And a couple of us in the cast will come out and we will hand you, in fact, I think I've got a couple here. We'll hand you some of our episode title slips that we have here. And we invite you to write down the name of a hypothetical episode of Doctor Who that you have never, ever seen before, but you've always wanted to see made. We do try to encourage people that it is an hour of whimsy and wonder. We don't want to be doing an hour of modern political discourse. We're not satirists, and indeed it is a family show, So if you want to sit through an hour of Doctor Who versus Donald Trump, I think you're probably in the minority, to be completely honest. So we try and discourage people from doing that. And of course, it's a family show. So if people have anything rude they want to write down, we go, look, we're not going to read that out in front of children, as it were. So we ask people to write those down. They hand those to one of our other cast members on the way in. We put them into a big box to pull one out of. And essentially, the way the show is structured is we have three questions to ask. We have Doctor Who of us is going to be the cast. Or sorry, who is going to be the cast? Who of us is going to be the Doctor? We're all going to be the cast, but who out of us is going to be playing the Doctor? We ask Doctor where and when in time and space. So this is where we try to get the setting from the audience. And we sort of invite people to, shout out potential settings. We've had some like really, really incredible settings in the past. I think some of the more creative ones that sort of spring to mind are we once had an episode set in the sauce mines of Heinz 57, which I remember just hearing out loud, and I was like, yeah, that's evocative. That's exactly what we want. But we also clearly have that setting there. But also doing like the historical settings are really fun. We've done like the first Olympics. We've been to ancient Egypt a few times. We've even been to like more recent history, like we have done a couple set in like World War II. We even did one in like the Korean War, which was great because functionally the Korean War is not something that we as British people know a huge amount about. It's not necessarily like in our education. So I'm sure it was an incredibly accurate depiction of exactly what happened in the Korean War. But we also get a lot of, contemporary settings. We get a lot of people who, for some reason, want us to go to retail outlets. So we've been to IKEA a couple of times. Just the other day, we went to Big Tesco, which I'm sure to a lot of your American audience won't necessarily mean just as much, but all you need to know is that there is a supermarket chain called Tesco, and there are small Tesco's and there is Big Tesco, and Big Tesco is a thrill. Let's just say that. But we've also had a lot more sort of like ambiguous but contemporary settings. A really fun one we did last year was in a Norwegian fjord. And that was just like really, really evocative, because then we get to sort of like play with, okay, so we're in Norway. What are the Norwegian things we're going to bring into this? But also, how do we then tie it to the final question, Doctor, what is the episode title? Because whatever that setting happens to be, we then have to tie it to whatever we happen to pull out of that out of that hat. Whether it is Doctor and the Octopus, when Donna met Strax, or the cat's calling, so we've got to tie all those things together. So once we've got those three suggestions from the audience, we take it away, and it is then just an episode of Doctor Who. We've got our little cold open to set things up. We've got our opening title screen, and we go throughout. In terms of who might show up in that adventure, obviously we will always have a doctor, and there will always be the Doctor's companion, whoever that happens to be, and that's another really fun thing to play around with. Like, what do you tend to expect from a Doctor's companion, and how can we maybe toy with those expectations a little bit? In the past, sometimes we've just literally been like, hey, this companion happens to be French. One of my favorite ones from Fringe's past is whenever I just decided my companion was Winston Churchill, after the companion had walked on stage. And so now it's like, well, okay, for the next hour, you're playing Winston Churchill. Have fun. But beyond that, it absolutely depends from show to show, and it will always be the most appropriate callbacks and so on. Like, obviously, sometimes the episode title that we happens to get will sort of summon, if you will, a character, whatever it happens to be. If its title happens to invoke, as I had there, Donna, well, we're going to see Donna at some point. If it happens to mention, oh, it's the cyber invasion, well, we're obviously going to have some Cybermen, or if the Daleks are mentioned, or the Adipose, or whatever it happens to be. And indeed, sometimes the setting will mandate it. We have done a couple of episodes set in sort of classic Doctor Who locations, whether it's Gallifrey, whether it's Skaro, whether it's Mondas. That was a really fun one as well, because sort of like the ongoing conceit of the whole episode was like, what are the things that make Earth and Mondas different, but also the same? So yeah, and of course, sometimes it's not necessarily dictated by the setting or the title. It's just dictated by wherever the plot happens to go. And in fact, I mentioned the Adipose earlier. We haven't done the Adipose much. They only kind of appeared in, I think technically a couple, but in terms of like as a main, not even so much villain, sort of ambivalent accidental problems in one particular episode years ago. But we had an episode that was set inside the human body, and as the plot developed, there was clearly something going wrong with this person, that they had an issue inside them, and it turned out to be the Adipose. And I remember standing off stage, and the moment that was invoked, I was just like, yes, that's correct. That's absolutely what should be going on here, and that's part of the joy of improv, is sort of sitting off stage, or indeed on stage, of course, someone revealing who they are, revealing what actually the scheme is, and you're like, Of course it's that. It absolutely makes sense. From time to time, we do have our own sort of more original villains that don't necessarily invoke particular things. I mean, a couple of years ago, we had a couple of episodes where we had brand new Time Lords that we'd never met before, like the cheese sommelier. We also had an episode the other night where the main villain was actually one of the jelly babies from classic Doctor Who that sort of was now out for revenge, having been abandoned back in the 70s. And indeed, another great example was, I always think back to this episode, but it was one we did either I think it might have been 2017, maybe 2018. And it was set in Machu Picchu. And there was this really strong, plot and scheme going on, where essentially someone was trying to block out the sun, and they were building a bit like in that episode of The Simpsons, where Mr. Burns builds his big sun blocking device. Someone's trying to block out the sun from the entire Earth. And it was really, really like fun episode, really, really evocative episode. But I was playing the Doctor, and even I'm kind of going, I don't actually really know. We're getting relatively, like 2/3 of the way through this, and I'm not really sure who the villain is. We know what the scheme is, and again, Doctor Who is a mystery, but we're really not sure. Like, no one has sort of like latched onto that thing of like, of course, this is being done by the Master. This is being done by whoever. So I essentially just threw something out there, and I turned to my companion, who was being played by Matthew, and I said, I can't remember what their name. I think their name might have been Jeanette. And I said, Jeanette, who in the world hates the sun the most? And Matthew, kind of in a moment of like blind panic, just went, oil barons? And I just immediately went, yes, oil barons hate the sun because they hate solar power, because that's going to take away all of their wealth. And it was just that sort of moment of serendipity where I was just like, Matthew, give me a hand here. Tell me what you think is going on. And I was sort of like half anticipating them to say, okay, you know what? It's going to be the Daleks. It's going to be the Cybermen. It's going to be whatever. And instead, they just, in that moment of panic, said something functionally completely random. And I was just like, yes. Like, I don't want to be too cliche about like yes and an improv, but I was like, of course it's oil barons. It makes perfect sense it's oil barons, and here's the really good reason behind it. So you can get absolutely anything. You could get some classic villains, you could get some new ones, or you could get some of our sort of like twists on more classic Doctor Who tropes. The story of how we came to do specifically Doctor Who is kind of interesting. Essentially, most of us in our sort of like core cast, we're fans of like the modern reboot Doctor Who, sort of Russell T Davies era, brings it back. That period. But you have a couple of cast members who have a bit more knowledge of sort of like historical Doctor Who. But on the whole, what drew us to the property, and indeed what draws like most of our audience to the property, is everything that's happened sort of post 2005. And to be frank, it was at some point during the Peter Capaldi era of Doctor Who. I mean, evidently this was, as I said, it's 2015, 2016. And I will speak purely for myself. I don't want to speak too much for everyone else from the cast, but I found a lot of Stephen Moffat's show running to be a little more frustrating. And in particular, I sometimes thought, I don't really feel like this is for kids. Like there were some times where I thought it was a little too dark, a little bit too serious or whatever. Plenty of fun stuff that did happen, and I did really love like Peter Capaldi as Doctor. But there's just parts of that era where I was thinking like, this just feels like a drag. And essentially there was a particular episode that aired, and a couple of days later, a bunch of us were all just sitting in the pub having a few drinks. We've been discussing various things, but we talked about this episode in particular, and we sort of thought, man, that was not great. We could have improvised a better episode than that. Ah, ha 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 ha. Like not really thinking anything further than that. And so it wasn't until, as I say, Lewis had sat us down and we were brainstorming, okay, we want to take a show up to the Fringe next year. What do we want it to be? And someone brought up, we could improvise Doctor Who. Okay, yeah, we'll put that on the list. And we had a few other things on there, but we kept coming back to Doctor Who. We kept coming back to, this feels like a really strong idea. And in hindsight, I think we're absolutely correct. I think one of the things that's really fun about doing an improvised Doctor Who is that it can be set literally anywhere. Like you have a time machine that can go through all of time and space, and you can pick any location, any time period. You can make up any location, any time period, and bam, you're there. And it makes sense. You don't have to do the thing that sometimes improv shows have to do, or sort of like tiptoeing around justifying, well, why do we happen to be in this sort of futuristic robot factory? It's like, no, we're in a futuristic robot factory. It just exists. That's fine. That's the world. We can skip over that level of plot explanation because, like, yeah, this is where we are, and that's what Doctor Who does as well. Like, they don't really labor the justification of why these things exist. They just go, yeah, this exists because it does. It's like, cool, great, let's get on with the adventure. So yeah, we just kept coming back to it until eventually we went, well, all right, let's give it a go. And we had a few different ideas for what we would name it. Like I'm really happy with the name we've come up with. Any suggestions, Doctor? I think it's nice and evocative, but also at that point, I think it's fair to say, in terms of the sort of parody area, although we're protected by sort of parody law and so on and so forth, we didn't want to just explicitly say the Doctor Who improv show. So it was evocative of Doctor Who without like explicitly saying anything. Um, but we had some other ideas. I think one of the ones that really stuck with me was we came up with the name Impromptu, which out loud, I think I remember like I was coming up with that and I was like, man, I really love that. That's so clever. That's so whatever. And it really gets across like the sort of like the improvised nature of it while also having who in there, but a bit of wordplay, love a bit of wordplay. But then written down, it just looks like impromptu, which isn't anything at all. So we settled on Any Suggestions, Doctor, and we started developing from there. And it's a big property to tackle. Of course it is. And it's a big property that a lot of people are very, very passionate about. And that's part of why we put so much work into developing exactly what we wanted from the show, exactly what we wanted to deliver from the show. When we were, during some of the earlier workshopping and brainstorming periods, we thought at one point, okay, do we want each of us to sort of take on a couple of incarnations of the Doctor, so that if hypothetically I become the Doctor, I could be, Christopher Eccleston, but I could also be Tom Baker, whatever that happens to be. And after we'd done a few more workshops like that, we realized we're not impressionists, we're improvisers. So we scrapped that, we moved away from that, and we realized that actually gave us a lot more freedom in terms of sort of parody and pastiche and so on, because it means that if I happen to be portraying the Doctor, I can take a couple of the things I like from a couple of my favorite Doctors, but I can also like play around with them and I can twist them a bit. One of my favorite things I've ever done with the Doctor is to sort of, the Doctor is an incredibly intelligent character. They know everything. They know absolutely everything. They have all the knowledge. They have all the expertise and know-how. And one of the things I find fun to sometimes do if I'm being the Doctor is actually to be a little bit more sort of dim-witted, if you know what I mean, and sort of taking a bit more of a back seat. And actually, it's kind of the companion who has all of the like implicit knowledge and know-how of the area, and I'm sort of like following their lead a little bit more, but also still ultimately being the one to save the day in whatever way, shape, or form that should take. And it also gives us a lot more freedom to play around with other tropes of what being the Doctor means. Like Doctor is never cowardly, always kind. Well, what if they're a little bit cowardly? Or what if they're a little bit mean? Or what if they just acknowledge from time to time, I know I say I never kill anyone, but I've done a genocide of the Daleks like 4 times by this point. I've killed all of the Time Lords a dozen times. Like, what if the Doctor was a little bit more self-aware that, like, okay, they're a bit self-aggrandizing, but actually this is all a bit hypocritical. But even playing around with some of the other characters as well. One of my favorite things that we do from time to time is when we're playing the Daleks. We sort of inevitably end up, in actual Doctor Who, if Daleks do have names, they tend to be quite sort of intimidating or ethereal names of some sort, like Dalek Khan, Dalek Sek. We always end up calling them like Dalek Barry, Dalek Elaine, and then they just end up having this much more like domestic relationship with each other. I think one of my favorite examples of a way where the Doctor had not necessarily defeated the Daleks, but intimidated them, was to just be like, if you don't stop your scheme, I'm going to tell your dad. And they're like, no, don't tell dad. And just, really sort of playing around with that side of things. You don't want to go too far down that line, because obviously we do want it to be, ultimately, as much as we want it to be like a fun show, a funny show, we also do still want it to have everything that Doctor Who is. Doctor Who crosses so many genres. One of those genres, of course, is comedy, but those other genres are like, you've got drama, you've got mystery, but the thing I really want to try and hammer home as much as we can is that horror side of things. Doctor Who is a lot of the time a horror show, and I think when it is at its best, it is when it really is like making you feel uneasy, uncomfortable. and you know the Doctor is going to save the day, but actually not everyone's going to get out of this okay. And the times we have done that in our show have been the most magical times that I think I personally, as a performer, have ever had. The show has definitely evolved a lot since 2016. As I say, I think in 2016 we were, as I say, it had a much more of a vibe of like we were kids in a toy box. We're getting out there, we're doing the sort of like fairly obvious Doctor Who jokes a lot of the time. And it's very fun. And we did have, of course, a couple of really great plots in there. But I think it's fair to say, probably looking back at that, it's a lot more rudimentary. And I honestly think one of the things that really helped us take the show to the next level was getting a live score, getting our live radiophonic workshop. Excuse me. So in that first year, we had a guy called Alex Rushforth, and he sort of like helped sort of frame a lot of that music and so on. And we now work with a guy called Nick Upton, who's a terrific musician as well. And I think one of the things that's been really helpful about having that musical score backing it is that helps to steer the scenes as much as anything else. When previously we were kind of just using like pre-recorded background tracks that functionally are kind of quite stagnant, it's fair to say, or at the very least predictable. Like if you've heard like this sort of like background track once, and then you're doing a show like a few days later, like, okay, yeah, I know exactly what the tone of this scene's kind of going to be. Whereas having the live music in there allows Nick and whoever happens to be doing the music for us to help steer or direct the scene. If sometimes it does, we might be feeling a little bit aimless, but if he just gives us like that little twinkly uplifting tone behind it, that lets us know, oh, okay, you know what, maybe we should pick up the mood a bit. Or indeed, if it gets more sinister and it's like, nope, guess what, now this scene means bad news is afoot. So that's been really useful. But also I think one of the things that's been quite fun for us is watching Doctor Who the TV show evolve as well, and seeing how we can take advantage of that. What are the different tonal shifts in there? I think, as I say, the end of Stephen Moffat's run and certainly large parts of Chris Chibnall's run, I think, have had a much more like dark tone to them. Which, as I say, for a family show, for a show that is for kids, I don't necessarily know if I'm like as fully on board with, but it means we can then like play with that. Okay, what does it mean if we are going to have a more dark and sinister thing to it? I can't tell you the number of times where we've had the companion in our episode face actual mortal peril, and where we've had audiences like actually gasping. Like I remember there being one time we did an episode where so at basically the end of Chris Chibnall's run, his companion Bill gets turned into a Cyberman, and like one of those episodes ends with Bill as a Cyberman being like, "Doctor, I waited," and it's this like harrowing moment where you're like, "Wow!" Not only has the Doctor like allowed Bill to come to harm, but like this is one of the most horrifying things that could possibly happen. They've been turned into a Cyberman, and that's not something that you can just magic away. That has happened now. And we were doing another episode where sort of I was the companion, and the plot of the episode essentially was that the Daleks were turning people into Daleks, and I sort of thought, okay, great, this is a great thing to invoke. We're doing parody, we're doing pastiche. We will do the homage to this, and everyone's going to be laughing at this great reference we have done. And instead, I come out and say, very similar line of "Doctor, I waited," and the audience like all audibly gasp in horror. And I'm kind of on stage being like, that's not the reaction I was looking for, but that's incredible. We have made them care that much that they are gasping in horror. And I love getting that reaction out of people. And it's something I do think we have become much better at. We've become much better at allowing the plot and the narrative to drive what's happening ahead of forcing ourselves into the joke. We all most of us anyway sort of come from more of a short form background, and in a lot of short form improv you are punching for the joke much sooner than anything else, whereas in a narrative thing, sometimes if you go for the joke, that's going to undermine like the plot and the narrative. And one of the things I have tried to encourage everyone to remember is that It's that thing of truth in comedy, right? If you've built a scene, if you've built a world, if you've built characters that the audience believe in, when something funny happens, it's going to be get much more of a reaction. When something serious happens, when something sad happens, when something scary happens, it will get much more of a reaction from the audience than if you have built a sort of comedy slapstick character who only really exists to come on, say some funny lines, and do some weird physicality. If something bad then happens to them, the audience aren't going to be horrified. They're going to be like, yeah, I guess. And I think that's something we have become much better at, is actually allowing ourselves to be drawn more by the narrative and by the plot than forcing ourselves into the corner of, we've got to be funny at all times. Some of my favorite moments we've ever done in this show have been completely unfunny, completely deadpan serious, like just moments of silence where everyone's just sort of like allowed things to just bed in and sit in for a moment. And then that means when you do get to that more lighthearted moment, or when you do get to the reveal of, hey, guess what? The master has been defeated by their own hubris. It's that much more satisfying for the audience than just if it's nothing but slipping on banana peels and, doing all that sort of like much more zany side of things. Sometimes the show calls for that. Sometimes that's what an audience wants. We'll absolutely do that as well. But yeah, I really do appreciate how we have, not so much how the plots have developed, but how we have developed as improvisers at creating better plots. I think one of the things that I think is most magical about Any Suggestions, Doctor, is that, yes, we are doing parody, yes, we are doing pastiche, but we're doing a homage as much as anything else to Doctor Who. And Doctor Who is a show that is at its heart about love and acceptance and being who you are in front of insurmountable odds. And sorry, yeah, it's a really, really powerful thing to me. I think I don't think it's a hot take to say the past couple of years in the world have had like a lot of like darker moments, a lot more like serious moments. You sort of have to look at things and you go, wow, you look at the state of politics, you look at the state of like the COVID pandemic, it's not always been super uplifting. And we do a show that is without fail uplifting, and that is almost without fail has a really positive message. Like, I think it is really, as much as I made jokes earlier about the fact that the Doctor's done a couple of like genocides in their time, overall, the Doctor does not save the day with violence. The Doctor saves the day with love. And the Doctor saves the day with intelligence. And with community. The number of times of the day has kind of not really even been saved by the Doctor, but it's been saved by the people around them making sacrifices, doing the right thing. And I just love that our show can play a small part of that, that we can give people this message that like, hey, guess what? Maybe you're at a futuristic water park that has been overtaken by Cybermen who are turning all of the water into cyber water that is going to convert everyone here into horrific monstrosities. But if you remember who you are, if you remember the love you have for other people, then that will save the day. Like it is like it's kind of a joke in Doctor Who circles that the number of times, in particular under Stephen Moffat, but Russell T Davies had the same issue as well, and there's a little bit with Chris Chibnall as well, but like where love saves the day. The day was saved by the power of love. And like, yeah, that's a bit corny, and yeah, sometimes it's feels like a bit of a cop-out, but that's a great message, isn't it? It's a great message that if you love each other, and if you believe in each other, and if you support each other and you lift up each other, that you can conquer all. And especially in improv, like improv is absolutely a medium about cooperation, love, support, having each other's back, and to very literally be able to translate that feeling into a narrative is such a joy, and it does make me emotional sometimes. Like there were absolutely shows last year where either on stage or off stage afterwards, I was just like a little tear in my eye, and I was like, this is weird. We're doing a show that's ultimately about a time traveling, face changing alien. But guess what? There was a moment in there that really got to me. And so yeah, like the big message that I not just hope this show takes away, but that I believe this show sincerely takes away, is that, or the people take away from this show, my apologies, is that, yeah, love each other, support each other, believe in each other, and maybe from time to time beat a few aliens. You should come to Any Suggestions Doctor if you are a huge fan of Doctor Who. But also, if you're not a big fan of Doctor Who, we'll tell you everything there is to know. I think one of the things that I really do enjoy about this show is that it is completely accessible. We always make a point at the start of the show of being like, hey, give us a big cheer if you're a big fan of Doctor Who, but also give us a big cheer if you've just been dragged along by one of your friends. And sometimes those barometers are slightly more skewed than we might expect. I think we've only ever once had a crowd where we said, give me a cheer, been dragged along by a friend, and there was silence. But we've definitely had times where that second cheer is a little bit bigger, and we're like, okay, cool. So it's always going to be a show that is fun. It's, as I say, it's appropriate for people of all ages. It's exciting. It's an adventure. It can go anywhere in time and space. We've got a literal TARDIS on stage with us. We can go wherever you want. We can do whatever you want. Yeah, we're going to drop in the Doctor Who references for the big fans, but it's not going to be completely inaccessible. We're going to take you along for the ride. Like, trust me, I'm not the Doctor Who expert, like I have to spend as much time cribbing up before shows, just reading up on the TARDIS Wikia to be like, okay, in that past episode, we had such and such a character. Who actually are they? So that I can figure this out in case they come up in future. So yeah, it is completely accessible. So if you're a huge fan of Doctor Who, great, come along. You're going to love all that. If you're not a fan of Doctor Who, but you do just want a good fun hour of an exciting adventure with a really tight plot that, as I say, can go anywhere in time and space, Any Suggestions Doctor, the improvised Doctor Who parody, is the show for you. So we do actually have another show that we have taken up to the Fringe this year. It's an exciting debut for us. It's called Suggestions of the Unexpected. As the name implies, it is a sort of improvised homage to shows like Tales of the Unexpected, The Twilight Zone, even a bit of Goosebumps, probably fair to say. It's more like an improvised portmanteau horror story, or perhaps not necessarily horror, but let's say cautionary tale. So we get the prompts from the audience, and we are going to tell you a message, an important message about how you should live your life based on those prompts. It's really exciting for us. It is an experiment. It's also worth saying. I'm really looking forward to trying it out. It's going to be in the final week of the Fringe. Yeah, if you want something that's maybe going to be a little bit darker, a little bit more late night, not necessarily, bawdy, shall we say, but we're definitely going to be exploring some more serious tones than we might cross in Any Suggestions Doctor. So yeah, if you just want an improv experience that's a little bit different than what you've seen before, I would be delighted if people would come along to see Suggestions of the Unexpected as well. Hi, my name is Charles Dean. I am a director and performer with Any Suggestions Improv, and I'm up here this year with, in particular, Any Suggestions Doctor, the Improvised Doctor Who Parody. It's an improvised adventure in time and space. It's every night at 5:30 at the Pleasance Dome, and we'd love you to come along and join us on a rip-roaring adventure through time and space in our very own TARDIS to have an adventure with everyone's favourite face-shaping, time-travelling alien, the Doctor.